Hi again, Sophie Glenn here. We're continuing on our MIG welding series. So I turned the gas on and I made sure that my settings are correct for whatever material I'm welding. So now I'm actually ready to start welding. So to start off with, if you've seen the welding PPE or the metalworking PPE video, I advise you watch that. But just to reiterate, you want to make sure that you're wearing the proper attire for welding. So I have my welding jacket on here, and I've got long pants, and I've got my boots right here. So leather boots are going to be really preferable. If you don't have leather boots, then you can wear a pair of sneakers and just make sure to have the foot guards or the spats. Those are what those are called. So you can have leather spats that go right over your sneaker. But leather boots are going to be preferable here. So that's all good. I also have my MIG welding gloves here. So again, these are that thicker hide glove that I talked about in that PPE video. You are going to get a lot of spatter with the MIG welding, so you do want to make sure you're wearing a thicker glove so your hands don't get all burnt up. And you also want to have a welding helmet available. So this is an auto darkening one here, and it's got really cool flames on it, so you can look extra cool. But you can also use the just standard welding helmet that doesn't auto darken. But this one's nice because it'll darken to exactly the right shade whenever you need it. I'm not actually going to be doing any welding in the video per se, but just so you guys are aware of the welding attire you should be wearing then. So this will at least get you started. So what we first want to do is make sure that our gas is on. So it was on from that previous video, so it's set up to roughly 15 CFH. So it's set up to roughly 15 CFH. And I have, again, just an argon and CO2 mixture here. I'll turn my machine on and talk about some of the other parts of this machine. So this is a grounding clamp here. So essentially when you're welding, you want to create a circuit between the machine and whatever you're welding. And the reason we do that is because the welder is not going to know what it's welding until it's actually connected via a circuit like this. So if I connect this to a metal table here, and I have a piece of steel laying on here that I want to weld, then it'll create that continuous circuit. So this is probably the number one thing that people forget about when they're trying to weld. It's like, I can't weld, it's not doing anything. It's because they don't have the grounding clamp on it. So if you have a steel table, that's great. You can just clamp it right onto that steel table and it's out of the way. You can also clamp it to the piece that you're working on. So now would be a much more direct current, so that actually might work out a little bit nicer. So either way, you always want to make sure that the grounding clamp is on whatever surface that you're welding on. With that to say, if you're welding something on top of a fire brick and this is grounded to the table, then it's not actually going to complete that circuit, right? Because the fire brick it's basically stopping that circuit from doing its thing. So if you're welding on top of a fire brick, that's also a thing people forget. So you'll just have to make sure your piece is on the table itself, or you're grounded to the piece that you're working on. So fire bricks tend to get in the way, essentially. So always make sure that your grounding clamp is either clamped to the table or to the piece. Secondly, we have the gun, which I talked about a little bit. So this is our welding gun here. So I'll unwound this. So the machine is on, so if I pull this trigger, I can extend that wire outward, right? So that'll shoot out however much wire I need at that time. Generally speaking, you don't want the wire sticking out that far, because again, that's going to interrupt that circuit you're trying to create, and it's just going to create a really messy, spattery weld, if it'll do even that. So the general rule of thumb is to have it sticking out maybe no more than 1/4 inch above this piece here, which can come off. All right, stick that back on. This doesn't necessarily screw on, it just kind of sits in place. And I can trim that with a pair of MIG pliers, and I'll talk about these in just a second. They have a pair of snips on this side, if I can point to it correctly. So I can snip that in place. And it's sticking out just a little bit, so you can sort of see that here. So between 1/8 and 1/4 inch is pretty good, right? Another thing about this gun is it comes with a long lead, and you want to make sure that lead isn't interrupted by a bunch of spirals, or if it's not tied up in a knot or something ridiculous like that. So you want to make sure that lead has enough space for that wire to actually travel through. So if it's like bound up some way, that could impede how the wire is feeding out of the gun. So you always want to make sure that the lead is in a nice, you can't really see it on the floor here, but it's not tangled up or not wound up in a ball or anything like that. So it's just it has enough room for that wire to feed in and out of it. Right. So I won't get too much into the ins and outs of the gun just yet. So I can have this set up here. So I have my ground connected and my welding gun is ready to go. So now I just need to talk about my particular stance when I'm welding. So the tendency is to kind of, because you're going to be dealing with a lot of spatter, so the tendency is to sort of be really far away from it and let the welding do its thing. That gives you very little control over where you're actually welding, especially if you have a welding helmet on, you can't see anything until it actually starts making sparks. So the tendency is to want to be as far away from it as possible, and you kind of have to go into the flame a little bit. So the best way to go about working with this is to sort of triangulate your body. So if you have both your elbows on the table, and I happen to be right-handed, I can have one arm on the table, and that can actually help support the gun from up top. So I kind of have this motion going on, so it's right over my wrist, and I'll have a glove on, just for that sake. So I'll have a glove on here. So my wrist is basically acting as a means of control for that gun, so I can actually better direct where I'm actually welding, right? And since both my arms are on the table, I have more control over it, say, than trying to do something like this and angle it and do all sorts of other weird things. Especially if you're working on taller pieces and you're welding up in the air, it's always nice to have that elbow on the table, or at least to somehow ground your body to the table.